She gave them everything, her love, her home, her trust. One night, they sold her past for profit. But what they didn't know was that she was about to rewrite her future. The hallway was unusually quiet that night. The flickering light outside her bedroom door cast shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of memories past. Eleanor, a 67-year-old woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that once sparkled with joy, sat on the edge of her bed with a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She had just completed her night prayers and was about to tuck herself into the familiar comfort of her old quilt when a muffled whisper from the hallway caught her attention. Asterisk, she paused, her hand resting on the light switch. The voice was low, cautious. She could barely make out the words, but it was definitely her daughter-in-law's voice. The tone wasn't affectionate. Kafta was cold, transactional. Moments later, her son's voice joined in, equally hushed. Their room was 2 doors down, but the old wooden walls weren't thick enough to hide secrets. She listened, straining to catch the words. Asterisk, useless old thing. Could easily get a good amount for it. Asterisk, she won't even notice it's gone. Asterisk, a chill ran down Eleanor's spine. Her wrinkled fingers clutched the shawl tighter, her heart thudding with confusion and dread. What were they talking about? What were they planning to take? Asterisk, she lay back on her bed, unable to sleep, her thoughts racing. Over the past few months, her son Daniel and his wife Myra had grown distant. Ever since her husband Richard had passed away 3 years ago, the house had lost its warmth. Eleanor had used her small pension to keep the lights on and contribute to groceries. The home was hers, left to her by her late husband, but loneliness had made her welcome Daniel and Mira when they needed a place to stay. It seemed like the right thing to do back then. After all, what is a mother's house if not a sanctuary for her children? Asterisk, but what started as a temporary arrangement became permanent. Daniel lost his job and spent most of his time scrolling through his phone. Myra worked part-time at a local salon, often coming home frustrated, snapping at Eleanor for the smallest things. They occupied the larger room, took over the living space, and slowly relegated Eleanor to her small corner of the house. She cooked less, laughed less, and stayed in her room more. She kept her valuables close, not that she had many, but her wedding ring, her Richard's ring, remained a treasure. She no longer wore it every day. Her fingers had thinned with age, and she feared losing it. Instead, she kept it in a small velvet box in the top drawer of her bedside table. That ring held stories, memories, laughter, and pain. It had been there through every up and down of their 43 years of marriage. It was more than gold. It was a piece of her soul. Asterisk, Eleanor tossed and turned all night, haunted by the tone of their voices. She won't even notice it's gone, Mira had said. Why did those words feel so pointed? The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, she forced herself to rise early. With trembling fingers, she opened the top drawer and reached for the velvet box. It wasn't there. She blinked. Perhaps it had slipped under some papers. She moved aside her reading glasses. An old photograph of Richard, a handkerchief, her breath caught in her throat. She opened the second drawer, then the third. The box was gone. She stood frozen, her knees shaking. Her chest tightened with panic and disbelief. The ring wasn't just misplaced. It was gone. Asterisk, she quietly closed the drawer, her face pale. Breakfast noises came from the kitchen. The sound of clinking dishes and Myra's footsteps echoed like betrayal. Eleanor walked to the kitchen with effort, trying to keep her face composed. Asterisk, good morning, she said softly. Morning, Mira responded curtly without looking up. Daniel was on his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. She stood there, for a moment, watching her son, the same boy she had cradled as a baby, whose fevered head she had held through sleepless nights. He didn't look up. Asterisk, I can't find my ring, she said slowly, trying to keep her voice calm. Asterisk, Mira looked up with feigned surprise. Your what? Asterisk, my wedding ring? It was in my drawer. The velvet box is missing. Asterisk, Daniel frowned and finally looked at her. Mom, are you sure you didn't move it? You forget things these days. Asterisk, her heart sank. There it was. The deflection, the gaslighting, the dismissal. She wanted to believe it wasn't true. She wanted to believe they wouldn't do this. But something had shifted. Something had broken. Asterisk, no, she said firmly. I remember clearly. I checked it just last week. I always kept it in the same place. Asterisk, Mira scoffed. Maybe you dropped it somewhere, or maybe it fell behind the dresser. You know how cluttered your room is. Eleanor nodded slowly, not because she believed them, but because she understood now that there was no use arguing. There was no confession coming. Not now. The rest of the day passed in a strange fog. She went through the motions, the floor, boiling tea, sitting by the window, but her mind was elsewhere. The whispers from the hallway echoed louder now in her memory. Every laugh Myra shared with Daniel felt like mockery. Every time they closed the door behind her back, she heard betrayal. She sat by the window late into the evening, watching children play in the street below. She thought of Richard, of the quiet strength he carried, the way he used to hold her hand when they walked to the market. He would have known what to do. He would have protected her. Now, she was alone in a house filled with people who once loved her or pretended to. That night, as she lay in bed, she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, remembering the day Richard slipped the ring on her finger. For better or worse, he had whispered, tears in his eyes. She had never imagined the worst would come decades later, not from him, but from their own blood. By morning, Eleanor made up her mind. She would not cry. She would not confront. She would not beg for something that should never have been stolen. Instead, she would wait. She would observe. And then, quietly, she would take everything back. Not just the ring, but her dignity, her peace, and her home. Something inside her had changed. A quiet storm began to brew within her maid. Not of rage, but resolve. The woman they thought they could silence had just begun to listen. And soon, they would hear her in ways they never imagined. The sun rose with a gentle warmth, but Eleanor's heart felt colder than ever. A quiet dread had settled into her bones like a winter chill that refused to leave. She went about her morning routine, each movement deliberate and slow. She made tea with her trembling hands, the familiar sound of boiling water offering no comfort. Her eyes kept glancing toward the hallway, where Daniel and Mira's door remained closed. A part of her wanted to storm in and demand answers. Another part of her, the stronger, wiser part, told her to stay calm. The truth had already revealed itself. Now, it was time to listen and wait. The house, once filled with the music of laughter and the scent of warm bread, had grown quiet and unfamiliar. Daniel barely spoke to her these days. Myra treated her like an inconvenient object, something to be stepped around or scolded when in the way. But Eleanor was no fool. She had seen the way they looked at her jewelry drawer over the past few months. She had ignored the subtle glances, the way Myra hovered near her bedroom when she thought Eleanor was napping. She had turned a blind eye, choosing to believe in the goodness of her son, even as it slowly vanished before her eyes. After breakfast, Eleanor retreated to the garden, her sanctuary. It wasn't large, but it had always been her pride. She sat on the stone bench near the rosebush Richard had planted for their 40th anniversary. The blooms were fading now, just as everything else in her life seemed to be. She traced the petals of a dying rose, lost in thought, when she heard the sound of a phone ringing from inside. Moments later, Mira's voice carried through the open kitchen window. Yes, I sold it yesterday, she said. I told you, it's just sitting there. No point in keeping it when we need the money. A pause. No, she doesn't know. She's so forgetful. Probably thinks she misplaced it. Another pause, followed by a laugh, dry, heartless, and sharp. I'm telling you, the old woman's practically senile. We'll be out of this dump soon. Just wait. The words hit Eleanor like ice water. Her hands tightened on her shawl. She hadn't just lost a ring, she had lost the last strand of illusion. They didn't just see her as old, they saw her as invisible, as a burden, as something to be quietly pushed out of the way, one betrayal at a time. Eleanor stood up, her legs weak but her will strong. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply turned and walked back to her room, shutting the door behind her. She sat down and opened a drawer, this one not where she kept treasures, but where she kept documents, her will, her property, papers, her bank details. She began reading, slowly and carefully, underlining with a pencil. A notebook lay open beside her, and she began writing things down, names, dates, thoughts. The silence was no longer passive, it was purposeful, strategic. Later that day, Daniel knocked softly on her door. Hey, Mom, he said, sticking his head inside. She looked up. Yes. You okay? You seem off. I'm fine, she said with a small smile. Just a bit tired, asterisk. He stepped in, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Mira and I were thinking, maybe you should consider a care home, you know, just somewhere with nurses and other people your age. Asterisk. Eleanor tilted her head. A care home, asterisk. Yeah, just think about it, okay? We're trying to help. We're just under a lot of pressure. Bills and stuff. Asterisk. Her smile didn't waver. I understand. It's good to plan for the future. Asterisk. Daniel seemed relieved, unaware of the storm forming behind her calm eyes. He nodded and left. Asterisk. That night, Eleanor wrote a letter. Not one to be sent immediately, but one she'd keep for later, when the time was right. In it, she explained everything she had learned, everything she had heard. She addressed it to Daniel, but the words weren't bitter. They were simply true. She told him what the ring meant, how she had survived losing Richard, only to now lose the respect of her own child. She didn't accuse, she didn't need to. The facts would be enough. Asterisk. In the following days, she observed more closely. Mira came and went, often in a rush, always whispering into her phone. Daniel, too, was distracted, constantly talking about moving out once the inheritance stuff was sorted. Eleanor played her part. She made tea, offered smiles, and pretended to forget things. She asked the same questions twice on purpose. She dropped a plate and apologized profusely. She watched how they grew more comfortable, more careless in their cruelty. They were convinced she was deteriorating. That was their mistake. Asterisk. One afternoon, when the house was empty, she took the spare keys and walked to the pawn shop, 2 streets over. She had a feeling the man behind the counter was young, distracted, but when she described the ring, his expression changed. Asterisk. Yeah, we had something like that come in a few days ago. Woman sold it, said it was hers. Asterisk. Do you have it? Asterisk. He looked uneasy. It's already gone. Sold the next day. Sorry. Asterisk. Eleanor nodded slowly. Did she give her name? Asterisk. No. But we have cameras, he said, gesturing to a monitor behind him. Asterisk. She smiled gently. That's all I needed to know. Asterisk. When she returned home, she didn't say a word, but something in her spirit had shifted. She felt like a ghost walking among the living, watching, remembering, planning. That night, she dug out an old address book and found the number of her childhood friend Margaret, now a retired family lawyer. Asterisk. Hello. Margaret's voice came through, surprised and warm. Asterisk. It's Eleanor, she said quietly. I need your help, and I need your silence. Asterisk. The conversation was short but powerful. Margaret agreed to meet discreetly the next day. Eleanor would bring her documents, and together they would begin drafting a new will. One that would leave nothing to Daniel and Mira. One that would legally protect Eleanor's home and possessions. One that would reclaim her power. Asterisk. The next morning, as she prepared to leave for the meeting, she looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was older, yes, but not broken. Her eyes, once dull with sadness, now gleamed with purpose. Asterisk. She tucked her documents into a bag, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The wind was soft, the air clear. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. Asterisk. She wasn't just an old woman grieving the loss of a ring. Asterisk. She was a mother betrayed, a widow dishonored, and she was ready. The days that followed became a delicate dance of silence and surveillance. Eleanor maintained her role as the forgetful, quiet old woman who spent most of her time napping, gardening, or rereading old books. But beneath the surface, she was alert, her senses sharpened by betrayal. Her children assumed they had her wrapped in a blanket of ignorance, mistaking her stillness for weakness. They had no idea she was already 2 steps ahead of them, quietly reclaiming control over the life they tried to steal, piece by piece. Asterisk. Every moment in the house now felt like a performance. Eleanor had become both the actor and the observer, watching the cracks widen in their facade. Daniel had grown more distant, often pacing around the house on his phone, speaking in vague terms about loans, down payments, and finally starting fresh. Mira, on the other hand, had become emboldened. She no longer feigned respect. Her words were curt, her glances filled with disdain. She had begun referring to Eleanor in the third person even, when she was in the same room. Asterisk. She's not using that cupboard anyway, Mira said one evening, pointing at the oak cabinet where Eleanor's china dishes were stored. We should donate it or sell it. Asterisk. Eleanor, sitting quietly by the window, turned her head slowly. That cabinet belonged to my mother. It's not going anywhere. Asterisk Mira's smile was forced, thin. Of course, just a suggestion. Asterisk it wasn't a suggestion, it was another test. Another attempt to chip away at the remnants of Eleanor's authority, to gauge how far they could push before she noticed or resisted. Asterisk, but Eleanor had noticed everything, every missing item, every whispered phone call, every time Myra snooped through her drawers under the pretense of cleaning. Eleanor no longer left anything valuable in the open. She had moved her documents to a neighbor's safe with Margaret's help and had begun recording small details in her notebook. Times, dates, conversations. Her world had narrowed to the walls of her own home, yet her vision had never been clearer. Asterisk one evening, while Mira was out, Daniel knocked gently on her door and stepped inside. He had that cautious look he wore whenever he wanted something, but didn't want to ask directly. Asterisk, hey, Mom, you remember that talk we had the other day, about the care home? He began. Asterisk Eleanor nodded. Yes, asterisk I talked to a place nearby, just to check prices and stuff. It's a really good place. Clean, nice staff, you'd like it. Asterisk she looked at him for a long moment. You want to send me away? Asterisk no, he said quickly. It's just, Mira and I are trying to get our lives together. It's been hard, you know that. If you were somewhere with more support, we could focus on work, and asterisk sell the house, she interrupted softly. Asterisk Daniel froze. What? Asterisk this house, that's what you want, isn't it? You can't sell it while I live here, but if I move into a care facility, asterisk his face turned red. That's not what I meant. Asterisk isn't it? The room was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. I've given you everything, she said, her voice trembling, not from weakness, but from holding back tears. I raised you. I buried your father. I opened this home to you when you had nowhere else to go. And this is what I get in return. Asterisk Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You're being dramatic, Mom. You don't understand the pressure we're under. I lost my job. Mira's barely making anything. We're drowning. Asterisk, and your solution is to sell what little remains of my life. Asterisk, he didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was a confession. Asterisk after he left, Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen long after the lights were off, staring at the empty teacup in her hands. There was a kind of grief that didn't come from loss, but from realization the moment you accept that someone you love is capable of hurting you not by mistake, but by choice. Asterisk the next morning, she called Margaret and arranged another meeting. This time, they sat in Margaret's home office surrounded by books and legal papers. Eleanor handed over the final version of her updated will and the property papers. Asterisk I want everything to go to charity, she said, or to a women's shelter. Not a single thing to Daniel or Mira. They don't even get to know I changed it until I'm gone. Asterisk Margaret looked at her, sympathy etched across her features. Are you sure? Asterisk I've never been more certain. They buried me in this house while I was still breathing. They've earned nothing but distance. Asterisk they signed the documents, and Margaret assured her everything was now legally protected. No one could change it, unless Eleanor herself didn't. She wouldn't. The sense of relief was strange, not joyous, but like breathing for the first time, after being underwater too long. Asterisk on her way home, Eleanor stopped at a small bakery and bought herself a slice of strawberry cake. She sat at a park bench and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. It was a small act of rebellion, of self-kindness. For once, she did something only for herself. Asterisk, later that evening, Mira and Daniel were watching television when Eleanor returned. She walked past them silently, her back straighter than usual, her steps measured. Mira barely glanced at her, but Daniel watched her closely, something uneasy in his eyes. Asterisk, the next few days passed quietly. Eleanor didn't confront them. She no longer needed to. Her battle wasn't in arguments or accusations, it was in her preparation, in the quiet reclaiming of what they had tried to take. Every moment she smiled at them now was layered with the knowledge that soon they would lose everything they thought they had secured. Asterisk, they would come to learn that the woman they dismissed as senile had outsmarted them, that the ring they stole was not just gold, but a symbol, and its theft was the beginning of their undoing. Asterisk, one night, Eleanor found herself standing in front of the mirror again. She looked at her reflection-creased skin, silver hair, tired eyes, but behind those eyes was a fire, a quiet, steady flame that would not go out. Asterisk, they thought she had forgotten. They thought they had won, but they had only awakened something far stronger than they anticipated. A mother who had given everything and would now take back her dignity, her peace, and her name. Eleanor stood in the backyard that morning, feeling the dew-drenched grass press softly beneath her worn slippers. A gentle breeze whispered through the garden, carrying with it the sweet, fading fragrance of old roses. It should have been peaceful. It should have been one of those rare, quiet moments when a person feels one with the world, but inside her chest, something heavy still churned, a quiet fire of betrayal and resolve that refused to die down. In the days that followed her conversation with Daniel and her visit to Margaret, Eleanor had perfected the art of emotional detachment. She no longer reacted to Mira's insults or Daniel's passive indifference. Instead, she had taken to chronicling her thoughts in a leather-bound journal, not out of nostalgia, but strategy. She wrote about her observations, her memories, her pain, and her plans. It became her confidant in a house where trust had died. On the surface, the house looked the same, quiet, mundane, and uneventful. Mira still complained about the prices of groceries. Daniel still slept late and blamed the world for his unemployment, and Eleanor, seemingly, still played the part of the aging, half-present matriarch who was too gentle to notice the shadows growing darker in her own home. But behind that calm exterior, Eleanor was no longer that woman. Her plan was now in motion. The legal arrangements were complete. Her will had been rewritten. Her possessions were either locked away or moved to safe locations with the help of kind neighbors and Margaret. More importantly, the house itself, the very place Mira and Daniel had been quietly planning to seize, was no longer theirs to hope for. Margaret had filed the property title under a trust, which would activate immediately in the case of Eleanor's absence or sudden illness. The beneficiaries, not her son, not her daughter-in-law, but a local women's shelter and a literacy foundation causes Richard and she had supported in their younger years. Despite the internal strength that grew within her, the emotional pain remained real. One evening, Eleanor found herself holding Richard's photograph a little longer than usual. His smile in the picture, wide, unfiltered, and full of life, brought tears to her eyes. She missed his voice, his laughter, and his grounded presence. He would have handled all of this differently, perhaps more directly, more firmly, but she also knew he would have been proud of the path she'd chosen. The quiet battle, the dignified revenge. It was around that time when Eleanor noticed something strange. Mira had become too quiet. Normally, Mira's presence was impossible to ignore. The constant complaining, the condescending remarks, the sharp glances, but for 3 straight days, she had hardly spoken to Eleanor at all. Instead, Eleanor caught her making long phone calls in hushed voices, walking nervously around the house. Once, Eleanor passed by her room and heard her arguing with someone. I told you we'd have it by now, Mira hissed. But she's still here. We can't kick her out without looking like monsters. A pause. Then a desperate whisper. No, the will's not signed, at least, I don't think so. She still acts clueless, but I don't trust her. I think she's pretending. That sentence sent a pulse through Eleanor's spine. She moved away from the door as quietly as she had arrived, her heart hammering with confirmation. So, they suspected her strength. Good, that meant they were nervous. But what came next disturbed her more deeply than she expected. The following day, Mira entered Eleanor's room while she was sitting on the bed folding her clothes. With a sugary smile that didn't reach her eyes, she said, "Hey, you've been cooped up too long. Why don't we go for a drive tomorrow? Maybe out to the countryside. A little change of air might do you good." Eleanor's eyes met hers, scanning her face like a detective reading a suspect. The countryside, yeah. Fresh air, you know. Trees, flowers, nature. You used to love those trips. Eleanor held up a folded blouse. That was when your father was alive. We used to drive to the lake every summer. Myra nodded eagerly. Exactly. It'll be just like that. Let's do it. But Eleanor's instincts screamed otherwise. The sudden warmth, the over-eagerness, the attempt to invoke a memory. Something wasn't right. She agreed with a gentle nod, but later that evening, she made a call. Margaret answered on the first ring. "I think they're planning something," Eleanor whispered. What kind of something? I don't know, but Mira wants to take me on a countryside drive. Out of nowhere. I haven't left the house in months. Why now? There was a pause on the other end. "Do not go alone. Margaret said firmly. I'll make some calls. If anything feels off, fake an illness. Say you have chest pain. I'll have someone from my office check in on you tomorrow afternoon. Just keep your phone with you. Eleanor thanked her and hung up. Her heart beat with a strange mix of fear and resolve. Whatever Myra had planned, Eleanor would not be walking into it blind. She spent the rest of the night writing in her journal, not a fearful goodbye, but a message of defiance. She was not afraid, and she was not weak. The next morning, Myra was all smiles again. She made breakfast a rare occurrence, and even served Eleanor tea. You look lovely, she said. That shawl suits you. Eleanor smiled softly. Thank you. It was Richard's favorite. By noon, they were in the car. Myra had packed snacks and a thermos of coffee. As the city disappeared in the rearview mirror, the trees thickened and the roads narrowed. Eleanor remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the horizon, hands clutching her bag where her phone and documents were safely stored. After nearly an hour of driving, they stopped at a small overlook by a hill. No houses, no people, just wilderness. Let's stretch our legs, Myra chirped, too enthusiastically. Eleanor stepped out. Taking in the view, she could hear the faint sound of birds, the rustle of leaves. It was beautiful and hauntingly empty. Isn't this peaceful? Myra said behind her. Eleanor turned slowly. Yes, very peaceful. But I think we should head back soon. I don't feel too well. Myra frowned. Oh, do you want to sit for a while? No, Eleanor said firmly. We should go. My chest is tight, and I forgot my pills. It was a lie, but it worked. Myra's expression flickered just for a second with frustration, then concern. Okay, let's get back. The drive home was silent. Myra glanced at her phone several times but didn't make any calls. Eleanor pretended to rest but kept her ears open. When they finally reached the house, Eleanor felt an odd sense of victory. Whatever Myra had hoped would happen, it hadn't. She stepped inside and immediately received a message from Margaret. Call me as soon as you're home. Do not delay. Eleanor called. Margaret answered quickly. Listen carefully, she said. My contact at the local courthouse confirmed something strange. Myra requested a meeting with a notary 2 days ago, claiming you were planning to revise your will and needed a witness to come to the house. She used your name. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. I have the request in writing, Margaret continued. I've already forwarded it to the authorities. You're not safe there anymore. Eleanor sat down on her bed, heart pounding. She stared at the wall as if it could offer answers. They hadn't just stolen her ring. They hadn't just tried to manipulate her. They were now attempting to forge her final wishes, to erase her voice completely before she was even gone. The betrayal cut deeper than anything before, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stood up, picked up her bag, and began packing. Essentials only. Clothes, medications, her journal, photographs. The house no longer felt like home. It was a battleground, and she was done fighting inside enemy walls. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Eleanor slipped out of the house with the help of Margaret's assistant. They drove her to a safe location arranged in advance. A small apartment above a bookstore owned by one of Margaret's friends. It was quiet, furnished simply, and most importantly, free of deception. Before going to bed that night, Eleanor wrote one more entry in her journal. They thought I was weak. They thought I was asleep, but I've never been more awake. They've taken my ring, my trust, and tried to take my voice. But they don't know the woman they've provoked. My silence was not surrender. It was preparation. And now, it's their turn to lose everything. She closed the book and turned off the lamp. The war wasn't over. But Eleanor had left the battlefield behind. And now, she would strike from a place they couldn't reach, not out of anger, but justice. The quiet hum of the bookstore below lulled Eleanor into a sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. It was her first morning in the apartment above Margaret's friend's shop, a temporary refuge, but one that already felt more like home than the house she had lived in for decades. There were no accusing glances, no slammed doors, no whispered betrayals, just the aroma of old paper and roasted coffee rising from the shop below. the creak of wooden floors, and a small window where sunlight streamed in like an invitation to start over. She made her tea slowly, savoring each step, as if reclaiming the ritual. Every small action now felt sacred. She no longer had to perform the role of the silent, aging mother whose thoughts were disregarded and feelings dismissed. Here, she was simply Eleanor, a woman betrayed, yes, but also a woman awakening. Downstairs, Margaret's friend Lily ran the bookstore with grace and a gentle firmness Eleanor admired. Lily was in her early 50s, with curly gray-streaked hair and bright eyes that missed nothing. She didn't ask too many questions, only offered Eleanor the upstairs space and said, "Stay as long as you need. We've all known women like Mira, and sadly, we've all been a version of you." Those words stayed with Eleanor. We've all been a version of you. That morning, Eleanor decided not to mourn. She would not cry over a son who had willingly turned her into a stranger. She would not grieve a daughter-in-law who saw her as an obstacle to comfort and wealth. She would, instead, use the pain they left behind as fuel. She began by organizing everything: her legal documents, journal entries, receipts of valuable items that had gone missing, and the report Margaret had secured from the notary office confirming Mira's forged appointment request. Every piece of evidence was placed into a red folder Eleanor labeled Truth. It was more than a collection of paper, it was her armor. But it wasn't enough to protect herself. Eleanor knew what she truly needed was accountability. By the end of the week, she and Margaret sat across from a female officer at the local legal aid office, presenting everything. The officer, a woman in her early 40s named Inspector Halima, listened quietly as Eleanor walked her through every detail from the stolen ring, to the forged notary request, to the suspicious countryside drive. Halima frowned often, made detailed notes, and interrupted only to clarify. At the end of the hour, she leaned forward and said, "This is elder abuse, Mrs. Eleanor, financial, emotional, even psychological. What they did and what they planned to do is not just immoral, it's criminal." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if finally hearing the validation her soul had been waiting for. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't overreacting. What they did was real. And now, the law would be made aware. A formal report was filed that day. The legal proceedings would take time, but Eleanor was no longer in a rush. She had found her footing, and she had allies now, people who saw her as more than a fragile old woman in a shawl. Lily often joined Eleanor in the evenings after closing the shop. They would sip tea together, talk about books, music, and the lives they had both survived. Eleanor opened up about Richard, his laughter, his stubbornness, how he loved gardenias and jazz. She cried once, maybe twice, but not out of sorrow. The tears were cleansing, like a spring rain after a long winter. Lily smiled after hearing Eleanor's stories. "You know," she said, "you still talk about love with softness. After all you've been through, that's remarkable." Eleanor smiled back, "Because they didn't take that part of me. They tried, but love was never theirs to steal." Meanwhile, Mira and Daniel had begun to panic. Eleanor had left a note on the kitchen table the day she vanished. It read, only 4 words, "I know everything now. No return address. No contact information." Daniel had called her cell phone dozens of times in the first 2 days. By the 3rd, the messages turned from concern to irritation, then fear. "Mom, come on, this is insane. Where are you?" "Mira's freaking out. Just tell us what you want." "If you think you can hide forever, we'll get legal action too, you know." Eleanor didn't respond. She had forwarded the voicemails to Margaret and saved everything on a flash drive. She no longer had to prove her fear, her absences, and their aggression had become proof enough. Back at the bookstore apartment, Eleanor found herself enjoying the calm routines. She began helping Lily around the shop, organizing shelves and labeling vintage novels. Her memory, which Myra had mocked so often, proved sharp and reliable. She even began writing again, short essays at first, then stories based loosely on her own life. Women like her, betrayed by family, forgotten by society, but never truly broken. She submitted one of those essays anonymously to a local literary magazine. A month later, it was accepted for publication under the title, The Ring They Stole. The editor's note read, a powerful, haunting story of aging, betrayal, and resistance, written with quiet fire and dignified pain. We are honored to publish this. Eleanor wept when she read that email. Not because she needed validation, but because her voice had finally reached beyond the walls of her sorrow. Justice, too, began to catch up. Inspector Halima visited Mira and Daniel with an official notice of inquiry regarding elder abuse and fraudulent activity. Mira's confident mask cracked quickly. She denied everything at first, but when shown the notary document and Eleanor's signed affidavit, her story wavered. Daniel, shocked by the severity of the investigation, began to unravel under pressure. I didn't know about the notary, he claimed. That was all Myra. I thought Mom was losing her mind. I didn't think it was abuse. But the law didn't bend for ignorance. Both of them were issued warnings and asked to appear for further questioning. The court would take weeks to make decisions, but Eleanor didn't need to be there. Margaret handled everything on her behalf. Instead, Eleanor spent that evening, sitting on a bench outside the bookstore, watching the sky turn golden with the setting sun. She didn't think about revenge anymore. That fire had cooled into something steadier, justice, not as a spectacle, but as quiet restoration. One afternoon, she received an envelope in the mail. It had no return address, but she knew the handwriting. It was Daniel's. Inside was a letter. Mom, I don't know what to say. I'm ashamed. I really am. Myra and I were drowning, but that doesn't excuse what we did to you. You were always there for me, and I treated you like you were nothing. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you're safe, wherever you are. I hope one day you can remember me not as the man who failed you, but as the boy you raised with love. Eleanor stared at the letter for a long while. Her eyes welled up, but no tears fell. She folded the letter and placed it between the pages of her journal. She didn't respond. That evening, she lit a candle by her window and sat beside it, remembering Richard. She told him, in her heart, that everything was finally changing, that the house was no longer a prison, that she was no longer afraid. That she had taken her life back, not with rage, but with grace. The world outside moved on, unaware of the storm that had passed quietly within the walls of an old woman's life. But inside Eleanor, there was peace, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had been turned into something stronger: truth, resilience, and dignity. They had sold her wedding ring, but they could never sell her worth, and they would never again hold the pen to her story. The autumn winds whispered through the narrow streets, as if they carried messages only old souls could understand. In the heart of a quiet neighborhood, nestled above the bookstore that had come to mean sanctuary, Eleanor stood by the window, watching the leaves fall. Orange, amber, and golden yellow danced through the air like forgotten promises. It had been nearly 6 weeks since she left her house, her former prison, and every day since had deepened her transformation from a silent victim into a woman of deliberate strength. Eleanor had settled into a gentle rhythm with Lily and the bookstore. Mornings were spent organizing shelves and chatting with customers who had no idea of the storm Eleanor had weathered. Afternoons, she wrote by the window reflections, fragments of memory, and the stories of women who had been discarded by those they raised. And evenings, she would sit quietly, sipping herbal tea, often thinking about Richard, about how proud he would have been. She spoke to him often, not with tears anymore, but with quiet gratitude. Somehow, through pain and betrayal, she had found her voice again. The literary magazine that had published her first piece sent her a letter requesting a follow-up. Her story had resonated with many, especially older women. Letters poured into the magazine, letters from widows, single mothers, grandmothers who had been betrayed by their children, sisters who had given too much, and strangers who felt seen for the first time. Eleanor read every word with trembling hands and a heart that began to feel something it hadn't in a long time: purpose. She agreed to write a second piece. This one she titled Buried While Breathing. It was sharper than the first, not just an emotional reflection, but a call to action for society to rethink how it treats its elders, especially women. It spoke of invisible abuses, of subtle thefts, of being reduced to burdens by the very people one birthed and fed. It ended not with bitterness, but with defiance. A message that said, "We are still here, and we are not silent." Meanwhile, back at the house that once held her captive in silence, The ground beneath Mira and Daniel continued to shift. Legal inquiries progressed. The forged notary appointment and the prior attempts to manipulate Eleanor's finances were under formal review. Myra's job at the salon grew tense as word of the investigation spread. Daniel, isolated and unemployed, spent most of his days trying to scrub his name clean, calling lawyers and distancing himself from Mira publicly even, if not emotionally. Eleanor didn't watch from afar. She let the process unfold through Margaret's careful handling. She didn't revel in their downfall, but she didn't pity them either. What they were experiencing wasn't revenge, it was consequence. For too long, they had manipulated love into obligation, twisted aging into weakness, and used dependency as a tool for control. They were not victims of circumstance. They were authors of cruelty. One Saturday, Lily invited Eleanor to a community book club that met in the back room of the store. Eleanor hesitated at first but agreed. The theme that month was resilience in female characters. They discussed novels like The Color Purple, The Awakening, and A Thousand Splendid Suns. Eleanor listened quietly for most of the hour, then finally spoke. You know, she said gently, the greatest resilience I've seen isn't always in rebellion or escape. It's in choosing to stay gentle when the world tries to harden you. In staying kind, even when you have every reason to hate. The room fell silent. Then, someone whispered, that sounds like something from a memoir. Eleanor smiled. Maybe it will be, someday. After that day, Eleanor began receiving invitations to speak at local libraries, women's shelters, even on a podcast hosted by two retired teachers. Word had spread about the anonymous author behind the ring they stole. Margaret had helped her publish under a pen name, but now the community wanted to know the voice behind the words. At first, Eleanor declined. Not out of fear, but modesty. She didn't think herself special. She wasn't an activist, she thought, just a woman who had been pushed too far. But Lily convinced her one afternoon, as they shelved books together. You think your story is just yours, Lily said, but it's not. It's thousands of women's stories. They just haven't found the words yet, but you did. And now they need to hear you speak them. And so, Eleanor agreed to attend a local reading at the Women's Center, 2 towns over, the night of the event. She wore a dark green shawl Richard had gifted her on their 35th anniversary. She read 2 short pieces, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The audience listened, not with politeness, but with the reverence one gives to sacred truths. When she finished, the applause was not thunderous, it was soft, warm, tearful. Women approached her after, not to praise her, but to hug her, to share their own stories, to thank her for giving language to a silence they had carried for years. That night, Eleanor walked home with Lily, the cold wind brushing against her cheeks. She felt reborn not because she had conquered pain, but because she had transformed it. Her story had become something larger than herself. A mirror, a light, a warning. The following week, a courier arrived at the bookstore carrying a small parcel. It was addressed simply to Eleanor. No return name, only a familiar scribble. Inside the parcel was a small velvet box. She stared at it for a moment, unable to breathe. With trembling hands, she opened it. There it was, her wedding ring, that one Mira had stolen, the one that had begun it all. There was a note tucked beneath the box, written in Daniel's hand. I found it. She had hidden it in her drawer at work. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I don't expect anything from you. I just thought you should have it back. Eleanor held the ring in her palm, the metal cold against her skin. She studied it closely, the tiny engraving on the inside still intact, E and R, always. Her heart swelled, not with sentiment, but with calm finality. The ring had returned, yes, but the trust, the connection it never would. She placed the ring in her keepsake box, alongside Richard's photograph, her journal, and the handwritten letter from the magazine's editor, not as a restored treasure, but as a symbol of everything she had overcome. Daniel's letter, she folded carefully and placed in her journal. Later that evening, as she sat by the window with her tea, Lily entered quietly. It was the ring, wasn't it? She asked gently. Eleanor nodded. Yes, Daniel returned it, double quotes, and how do you feel? Eleanor took a deep breath. I feel finished. Lily sat beside her, not healed. Healing is a journey. but I've come far enough to stop looking back. That, for me, is enough. Asterisk outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the last of the golden leaves off the trees. The air smelled of change, real change, not the kind that comes with force or fury, but the quiet kind that follows understanding. Asterisk Eleanor looked out, sipping her tea. She didn't know what the future would hold. Perhaps she'd write more. Perhaps she'd speak more. Or perhaps she'd simply live the rest of her years in peace above a bookstore, surrounded by books, kindness, and purpose. Asterisk, what she knew with certainty, though, was this. She had been buried while still alive, but she had climbed out. Asterisk, and she had walked away not broken but whole. Asterisk, not bitter but free. Asterisk, they sold her wedding ring while she slept in the other room, but they could never again steal her power. The sky was dusky when Eleanor stepped into the small garden behind the bookstore. The crispness of early winter lingered in the air, and the rose bush she had lovingly nurtured in her old home came to her mind. That garden had been her haven, once, before it turned into a trap. Now, even as frost crept into the earth, and leaves crackled underfoot, she felt more rooted than she ever had. There was no warmth in the air, but warmth had finally returned to her heart, a warmth of peace, earned, dignity restored, and purpose reborn. Asterisk, the past few weeks had unfolded like a second life. Her essay, Buried While Breathing, had gone viral in digital circles, with thousands of women sharing and reposting it, translating it into other languages, and quoting it in advocacy meetings and university seminars. What began as a deeply personal account of betrayal had turned into a mirror for millions. Letters poured in from across the country, from women in cities, in villages, in shelters, and even from retirement homes. They weren't just thanking her, they were revealing themselves, sharing traumas buried under decades of silence. Asterisk Eleanor read them all. Some made her cry. Others made her sit still in stunned silence. The stories were eerily similar: sons turning cruel, daughters-in-law robbing dignity, grandchildren forgetting the hands that once fed them. But there was also hope in these letters, a hope that perhaps they, too, could reclaim what was lost. Eleanor was no longer just a writer. She had become a voice, a symbol, and though that felt humbling, it also felt frightening. Asterisk, she never wanted to be famous. She only wanted to be heard. Asterisk, one afternoon, as she sorted through a new batch of mail in Lily's kitchen, she came across an envelope with official markings. It was from the city's family court office. Her heart skipped. She opened it carefully. Inside was a formal notice. The investigation into Mira and Daniel had reached a decision. Mira had been charged with attempted financial fraud and elder exploitation. She would face fines, and the matter would be on her public record for life. Daniel, though not directly involved in the forgery, had been reprimanded for willful neglect and psychological harm. Though he wasn't facing jail time, he had been ordered to attend mandatory elder abuse rehabilitation sessions and submit a public written apology through official channels. Furthermore, a civil restraining order had been granted in Eleanor's favor, ensuring that neither Daniel nor Myra could contact her without legal approval. Asterisk Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for several minutes, letting the words settle. Asterisk, it wasn't revenge. It wasn't even victory. It was simply justice, a reckoning. Not just for her, but for every woman who had been silenced under the guise of love and obligation. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her red folder labeled Truth. Asterisk, that evening, Lily found her in the back garden again, sitting on the bench with her shawl tightly wrapped, a far-off look in her eyes. Asterisk, it's done, Lily asked. Asterisk, Eleanor nodded. Yes, it's over. Asterisk, but even as the words left her lips, she realized something deeper. This story was never just about her ring, her house, or her betrayal. It was about something older, something systemic. It was about how the world saw aging women, how society treated them as disposable the moment they no longer served a financial or emotional function. Asterisk, Lily, she said quietly, I think I want to do more. Asterisk, Lily smiled knowingly. I hoped you'd say that. Asterisk, in the days that followed, Eleanor worked with Margaret and several community advocates to organize an awareness campaign called Silent No More. It would feature real stories from older women, anonymous if needed, along with resources on elder abuse, legal rights, and helpline numbers. They began by building a website and printing brochures. Eleanor wrote the introductory essay, Asterisk, they took my ring, thinking it was just gold. Asterisk, they didn't know it held my history, my loyalty, my love. They tried to erase me while I still breathed, but I am not gone. Asterisk, and I am not quiet anymore. Asterisk, the essay was printed on the first page of the pamphlet. Lily and Eleanor distributed copies in libraries, health clinics, social centers, and even bus stops. Local news channels covered the initiative. Interviews followed, and though Eleanor refused to show her full face on television, she allowed her voice to be heard, calm, steady, and filled with the kind of strength that made people pause. Soon, a foundation reached out, a non-profit focused on the welfare of senior citizens. They wanted Eleanor to speak at their annual conference in the capital. The honor was unexpected, overwhelming even, but something within Eleanor told her to accept. The night before her travel, she sat at her window again, writing in her journal. Her hands were steady now, the once shaky lines of grief replaced by words that carried intent. Tomorrow I stand not just for myself, but for every mother who was called a burden, every grandmother who was forgotten, every widow who was silenced. We are not the past. We are the spine of every home, and we will no longer bend quietly. She closed the journal and exhaled deeply. At the conference, the room was filled with professionals, doctors, therapists, social workers, policymakers. Eleanor stood behind the podium, nervous but poised. She told her story, beginning from the quiet night they whispered outside her room, to the moment she left with nothing but resolve in her bag. She spoke with outrage, only clarity. The silence in the room was unlike any other. When she finished, the applause was long, slow, and standing. One of the speakers approached her afterward with tears in her eyes. My mother died 2 years ago, the woman said, and I think I ignored her pain because I was too busy. I thought she was just being difficult. Your words helped me see her differently. I wish I had heard you sooner. Eleanor embraced her. Then, do better for someone else now. Returning home, Eleanor felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. The bookstore greeted her like an old friend, and Lily hugged her tight. You did it, Lily said. You've created change. Eleanor smiled. I think we've only just begun. She spent the following week mentoring a small group of women at a local shelter, helping them write their own stories, file claims for abuse, reconnect with lost family, or simply find the courage to speak up. Eleanor never saw herself as a savior. She saw herself as a survivor who had simply chosen to speak. One afternoon, while watering the indoor plants, she received a letter from Daniel. It wasn't written on lined paper or in desperation like the last one. This time, it was typed and formal. Dear Mom, I understand the legal orders and respect them. I won't contact you again unless permitted. I've enrolled in the court-mandated program and have started volunteering at a senior care center. It's hard, confronting who I became, but I wanted to let you know that I am trying. Not for forgiveness, just for accountability. I hope you are well. Sincerely, Daniel. Eleanor read it twice, then folded it and placed it in her journal. She didn't cry. She didn't smile, but she whispered softly, at least you're learning. That night, as she sipped tea under a woolen blanket, Eleanor realized something powerful. She no longer felt broken. The ring, the house, the betrayal, they were part of her story, yes, but they no longer defined her. She had rewritten her ending, and it didn't end in silence. The air was crisp, touched with the promise of a changing season. Eleanor stood on the rooftop terrace of the bookstore, a soft breeze teasing the edges of her shawl. Below, the town moved in its usual rhythm. Bicycles hummed past, children laughed near the bakery, and the scent of fresh ink drifted up from Lily's printing press downstairs. But, above it all, Eleanor stood still, steady, and unshaken. She was no longer watching life go by from behind drawn curtains. She was part of it again, fully, freely, and finally on her own terms. The last chapter of her old life had ended, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a series of quiet revelations, each one peeling back another layer of grief, deception, and suppression. Now, in the sanctuary she had built from the ashes, Eleanor was beginning something new, and though she had crossed many thresholds in her life, marriage, motherhood, widowhood, this one was different. This was a beginning born not from tradition or tragedy, but from conscious, radical self-reclamation. It had been months since she had last seen her son, Daniel. The court orders were still in effect. She had received 2 more letters from him, both carefully worded, respectful, and restrained. In one, he shared reflections from the elder abuse awareness course he was attending. He admitted to his emotional negligence, his complicity in Myra's manipulations, and the cowardice that had kept him silent while Eleanor suffered. In the other, he offered no excuses. He simply wrote, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I will live every day trying to be someone who would have once made you proud." Eleanor read those words and held them for a long time, not in anger, and not in absolution, but in acknowledgement. She would never forget the pain Daniel had allowed, but she also would not allow it to chain her. To forgive, she had come to understand, didn't always mean to reconcile. Sometimes it meant to release. She wrote him back once, a single page, "I hope the man you become is kind, honest, and strong enough to never make a woman feel invisible again. That's all I ask." She never heard from him again after that, and she was at peace with it. Mira, on the other hand, vanished from their lives entirely. After her legal penalties were made public, she lost her job and relocated. There were rumors of her working in another city, but Eleanor didn't follow them. Whatever road Mira took next, it was not hers to walk alongside, not even in memory. Eleanor poured her energy into the Silent No More campaign. What had begun as a modest awareness pamphlet evolved into a nationwide initiative. A small team of women, most over the age of 60, managed the entire operation, answering emails, attending forums, and organizing storytelling sessions at community centers. Eleanor trained dozens of women to write their stories and encouraged them to speak on radio shows and in support groups. She often told them, "We weren't born to be erased. Our wrinkles are not cracks, they are roots." The phrase became the campaign's tagline. It was printed on posters, tote bags, and bookmarks. For the first time, women in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s were becoming visible voices in a world that had long overlooked them. And yet, despite the movement's growing reach, Eleanor remained grounded in her own simplicity. Her days began with early morning tea, often taken near the bookstore's front steps. She still read voraciously, wrote regularly, and made time to tend to the few potted plants she had arranged on the terrace. One plant, a delicate gardenia, had been gifted to her by a young woman named Noor, who had come to one of her writing workshops. Noor was 22, a domestic abuse survivor, and had lived in a shelter after escaping a violent marriage. She had lost contact with her own mother and felt abandoned in the world. After attending Eleanor's session, she had returned with a letter, placing it quietly in Eleanor's hands before leaving. "You made me believe that surviving isn't shameful, that silence isn't safety, and that my life, however broken, can still be beautiful." The letter touched Eleanor deeply. She reached out to Noor and began mentoring her, not just as a writer, but as a woman. It was the closest Eleanor had come to motherhood again, not through blood, but through choice. The two would often walk together in the park or share long talks on the terrace. Eleanor didn't try to fill Noor's wounds with answers. She simply listened, truly listened, something no one had done for her in her own home for years. The bond between them blossomed into something neither expected, kinship born of shared strength. It was Noor who eventually suggested the idea that would mark the next chapter of Eleanor's legacy, a book, not a memoir, but a collective anthology of stories from women all over the country who had suffered elder neglect, emotional abandonment, or domestic betrayal. Eleanor titled it The Room Where They Left Us. Each story in the book was edited carefully, ethically, and with full consent. Some women used their names, others chose pseudonyms. The pages dripped with honesty, not dramatic embellishments, but raw truth. Each account, a wound made visible. Each voice, a thread in the fabric of collective resilience. The book was published by an independent press and, to everyone's surprise, became a bestseller. Bookstores held readings. Schools began using it in social work and gender studies. Classes, the impact rippled outward. But Eleanor remained unaffected by the noise. For her, the reward had never been recognition. It had been liberation. One quiet evening, she sat on the rooftop, the final rays of sun folding into twilight. Noor was beside her, writing in her notebook. Lily was downstairs, laughing with a customer. In the distance, a choir of bells signaled the closing hour of a nearby chapel. Eleanor opened her own journal, the one she had started the night she left her house, and began writing her final entry. It began with a whisper in the hallway. A missing ring, a silence that screamed. They tried to write me out of my own story. But I picked up the pen. And I rewrote everything. She closed the book and looked out across the rooftops, her heart calm, her soul light. They had sold her wedding ring while she slept in the other room, but she had awakened. She had risen. And now, she was no longer a shadow on the edge of her family's life. She was her own light, her own legacy, and her story, was far from over. The late winter sun filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's room, casting delicate shadows on the wooden floorboards. It was a quiet morning, the kind she had grown to love. Outside, the streets hummed with the slow bustle of everyday life. Somewhere, a dog barked lazily. Bells from a distant church rang noon into the air. But inside, Eleanor sat in complete stillness, holding a thick envelope in her lap, her fingers lightly brushing against the corner. It had arrived earlier that morning, a legal parcel from the municipal records office. She hadn't expected it today. She had almost forgotten it was still pending, but the weight of it in her hands brought back everything. All the steps she had taken, all the roads she had crossed, not just physically, but emotionally. She sat quietly for a few moments longer before breaking the seal and unfolding the documents within. At the top of the first page, in bold letters, it read, Certificate of Ownership, Transfer, Public Trust, Custodianship Name, Eleanor R. Walters Status, Completed the house, the one she had lived in for over 40 years, where she had loved, mourned, suffered, and finally reclaimed herself, no longer bore her name alone. As per her will and the legal trust formed months ago, it now belonged jointly to two organizations, Women's Roots Foundation and Hearthlight Shelter for Abused Mothers and Widows. Both names had been chosen with care, after many conversations with Margaret, Lily, and the women Eleanor had come to know during her journey. It would no longer be just a house. It would be a sanctuary, a transitional home for elderly women facing abandonment, isolation, or betrayal. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. There was no sorrow, no nostalgia, only peace. That house had once defined her. It had once imprisoned her. Now it would become a place of refuge and rebirth for others like her. And in that transformation, she felt herself finally released. Later, that day, she walked down into the bookstore, her steps slow but firm. Lily was placing new books on the shelves, and Nor sat by the register, editing a blog post for the Silent No More campaign's website. They looked up and smiled when they saw her. It's done, Eleanor said softly, placing the envelope on the counter. Lily's eyes sparkled. Truly. Eleanor nodded. The house belongs to them now. The trust is active. The first resident arrives in 2 weeks. Nor stood and wrapped Eleanor in a warm, lingering hug. You've turned pain into home, she whispered. You've changed lives. Eleanor smiled. We all have. Together. The three women sat in the back room of the shop later that afternoon, sipping cinnamon tea and talking about everything and nothing, just as they had many times before. But today felt different. Today felt like a conclusion and a beginning. The old threads had been tied, the loose ends stitched into purpose. Eleanor watched Nor speak passionately about the next stage of the campaign. She saw how confident the young woman had become, how her once shaking hands now moved freely as she sketched plans for storytelling sessions, podcast episodes, and writing circles. She reminds me of myself, Eleanor whispered to Lily when Nor stepped away. She reminds me of you, too, Lily said, but stronger, because she had someone like you to walk with her. Those words sank deep into Eleanor's heart. Once, she had believed her time was over, that her years of influence, of meaning, had ended with her husband's death, or with her son's betrayal. But now she knew better. She had not grown old. She had grown powerful, not in the way the world often defines power, but in the quiet way that truly shapes lives, by listening, by healing, by refusing to disappear. The official opening of the transitional house came a week later. It was modest, as Eleanor had wished. No media, no flashy event, just a small ceremony held in the old living room, now freshly painted and filled with light. A few potted plants adorned the windowsills. Soft rugs lined the wooden floors. Fresh sheets covered the beds upstairs, and bookshelves built by local volunteers stood proudly along the walls. Eleanor stood at the center of the room, her voice steady as she addressed the attendees, mostly women who had helped shape the project. This house once held silence, she said. It once held betrayal and grief, but today it begins a new life. It will no longer be a place where someone feels forgotten. From now on, it will remember every woman who walks through its doors, and in doing so, it will help her remember herself. A single tear slid down Lily's cheek. Nora clapped, her eyes shining. Margaret, who stood in the back beside a few representatives from the shelter, simply nodded. She had seen Eleanor through the darkest corners of this story, and now she was witnessing its light. The first resident, a 72-year-old woman named Salma, arrived that evening. Her story was heartbreakingly familiar. A widowed mother turned caregiver for her son and his family, only to be discarded once she was no longer useful. She entered the house quietly, uncertainly. But when Eleanor greeted her with a warm smile and placed a hand on her shoulder, something shifted in the woman's eyes. Hope, recognition, maybe even trust. Welcome home, Eleanor said. That night, back in the bookstore apartment, Eleanor sat on her bed, flipping through her journal. So many pages, so many memories, from the moment she overheard the whispered betrayal outside her door, to the day she left with nothing but her truth in a bag. The story was all here. She could see the woman she had been, the one who hesitated, who mourned, who doubted herself, and she could see the woman she had become, fearless, purposeful, complete. She turned to the last page and wrote, "They sold my wedding ring while I slept in the other room. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I would forget. But I remembered, and I rose. And now, I am more than what they tried to take. I am the home they never gave me. I am the voice they tried to silence. And I will never sleep through betrayal again." She closed the journal gently, setting it beside the ring box that now sat, not hidden, but openly on her dresser. She no longer wore the ring. It wasn't about sentimentality anymore. It was about reclaiming it, not as a symbol of what was lost, but as proof of what she had survived. That night, Eleanor dreamt of a garden. It was vast and bright, filled with every flower she had ever loved. Gardenias bloomed beside roses, and tall sunflowers stood proudly in golden rows. She walked barefoot across the soil, her feet firm, her steps light. Ahead, a group of women, young and old, waited for her beneath an arch of ivy. As she approached, they smiled and made space for her, welcoming her into their circle. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a heart full of calm. The next morning, she stepped onto the terrace with her tea and watched the sunrise spill across the town. Another day, another chance to begin again. She was no longer waiting for life to return to her. She had built a life from the wreckage. And now, at last, it was hers, not because someone gave it back to her, but because she had taken it.